everyone. I wanted to spend a little bit of time on the topic of overspending. This seemed to be a really hot topic this week, and I also think that it's something most of us can identify being problematic at one or a variety of different points in our life. So, what is overspending? It is under the classification of behavioral addictions. Basically, it's when somebody is spending beyond their means despite it being problematic and it starts to impact their life in a negative way. And that really looks like, of course, your financial wealth. Also, your mental health can be impacted by overspending significantly, your physical health, and it can really start to affect your relationships, particularly your individual relationship with self, but also within any partnership or family system if overspending is occurring by one or multiple people. So, overspending, I think when we think of that, a lot of times the term is tossed in the direction of women. And it's actually a myth that women overspend more than men. The language is very different, though. Women are more likely to identify as a shopping addict, as an overspender, emotional spender, things like that. Whereas men, what I found in my experience, are more likely to identify with overspending when it talks about collecting. Specifically, a lot of men will collect tools, devices, sports memorabilia, and so a lot of times I found that men find their way through and they really identify with the language of collector. Women and men, of course, both tend to overspend on technology, clothing, shoes, cosmetics, cosmetic procedures these days. Food is a really big ticket item. Things like Uber Eats are so accessible that people are doing this, and it costs a lot more money than, cooking yourself for the week or potentially going to a store to pick up. And so these are kind of the common things that people spend money on. Another thing that we spend a lot of money on is trips and traveling, short distance trips, long distance trips. And, ever since we were introduced to the concept of plastic in the late 80s, we really started to shift the way that we viewed and spent our money. And that's because when plastic was introduced, it's this idea that we don't have to have money up front now. We can just buy what we want and worry about it later. That is a very unhealthy idea that a lot of us practice each and every day, week, month. And so that's something to kind of deconstruct, because if you are struggling with overspending, the idea is that you're spending within your means, and I'll talk about some strategies in a little bit. When overspending usually starts to occur for folks is when they get their first credit card. And so this is when problems can start, so oftentimes in late teens. So for parents or educators, it can be so important to make sure that a young person has education as well as an idea of what debt consequences can be and how long they can last. So I think, ideally this information needs to be shared with the general public. I also find when somebody's financial system changes, that's when overspending can start to occur. So you see somebody get a promotion, a different job where they're earning a higher income. Sometimes that's where overspending can take hold. Overspending can certainly happen with folks that are struggling with finances as well, low-income populations, because a big reason why people overspend is to have some form of relief. A lot of times this relief is from our mental health challenges. So here is the big why in overspending. It's very rare that people are just, spending solely because it's fun. Shopping, browsing, purchasing, it produces dopamine in our brain, and so we feel good. A lot of times in my practice, when I work with overspenders, there's usually underlying anxiety, depression, self-esteem issues, loneliness, and a lack of connection. And so sometimes going out and about, or getting a package delivered, it feels really good. And so there's very, very understandable reasons as to why people do overspend. I also find that people that struggle with bipolar disorder can be very vulnerable to overspending, especially when they're in manic or depressive states, because again, you're shifting your mood. The consequence of this is that it may provide short-term relief, as most vices do, but longer-term challenges. Because if you've seen my Addiction in the Brain video, we talk about how when you repetitively do these behaviors, you build a tolerance and a dependency to them, which forms a really maladaptive habit that can be really, really hard to break. The aftermath of overspending is that a lot of people feel buyer's remorse. They feel guilt, it creates conflict, they start to avoid looking at that credit card statement, and avoidance does create a lot of anxiety or sadness or depression, frustration. So basically, overspending provides short-term relief, but long-term challenges to the mental health that you're likely already struggling with. So I want to talk about some strategies for overspending. One of my most favorite things that has now become an automatic practice to me is needs versus wants. So it can be really helpful, whether you're going to the grocery store, going on a back-to-school shopping trip, is to really identify what your needs are. Our needs are very, very basic, and a lot of times when we put pen to paper and create a needs versus wants, we end up shifting so much over from what we believe to be our needs over to the wants category. Needs are very fundamental. We need basic clothing, not an abundance of it. A lot of times people need transportation, they need money for gas. We need food in our fridge, healthy food that is going to fill us in a good way. We need access to water, certain vitamins. And so it's all about identifying what your actual needs are. A big part of needs is we also need money to pay for our ever so rising cost of living. And so identifying those kind of specifics as well as the cost of what you need. Wants become desires. And in my experience, because we are so hooked into this idea of instant gratification, wanting something, it being accessible, getting it instantly, the whole idea is for our wants, we actually want to practice delayed gratification. And that's because, if you were to go out and buy a couch today impulsively, you likely wouldn't appreciate that couch. You can come to resent that couch because of the cost of it and not having the money to pay off, and now it's on your credit card bill for a while. Or as we start to save up for the things that we want and finally be able to afford them without this heavy consequence of debt, we start to appreciate those things for a much longer period. So really think of the concept of delayed gratification. I practice this at the grocery store a lot, where a lot of times I'll look at the cart just before we check out and I'll try to take one or two items out, items that I feel like I don't truly need. The other thing is building a budget. This can be incredibly stressful, but know that there are a lot of great free tools available or apps. And if you go to creditcanada.com, there's a lot of information on helping you to build a budget for free. And so I really recommend that. A lot of our financial institutions, like I'm with TD, they have a My Spend app where you can actually start to track your expenses and kind of keep on top of this budget. But the idea is, and this is kind of taken from Gail Von Oxlade, who was a superstar in the show Until Death Do Us Part. I believe she still has a website and some great videos to watch. I would really encourage you to go in that direction if you're struggling. But basically, one of the best tools that I think she talked about was building a budget, having an allowance for what you absolutely can spend in a week or in a month, and then separating that allowance into 4 envelopes and switching to a cash system, because we pay more attention to spending currency. Why that is we have a biological attachment to that. When we pay with currency, it activates the pain receptors in our brain. So it physically pains us to hand over that small, medium, or large bill. We really think about what we're spending. When we pay with plastic, oftentimes we tap and go. We're not looking at the total. We don't keep receipts. And so spending really gets away with us because we are conditioned not to pay attention to it when we play with plastic. So I'd really encourage you, build your monthly budget, come up with your monthly allowance, what you can spend, have cash available, separate it into 4 envelopes. Each week of a month, you have access to one of those envelopes. If your budget for that week is $50 and you go out on Tuesday and spend that $50, you overspend, then it's not accessing week 2 envelope until it's time. And what you do is you sit in the consequence and the stress and the frustration, likely with self, that you spent that money. And it really makes you think about being more cautious spending moving forward. So that's a really great strategy as well, is separating it into an allowance, changing the system if the system is not working for you, knowing that we don't have that biological attachment to plastic. On that train, some people need to cut up their credit cards. Other people need to make a plan to repay debt. My strongest encouragement would be try to take a couple weeks, if not a month, off spending on your credit. Really stick to the idea that in order to purchase what you need or what you want, you have to have that money in your checking account. And so the whole idea is that you can change your relationship with credit and with plastic. So you don't have to totally remove it unless you're in a really bad situation and know that that's important to you. But the whole idea is that you stop relying on it the way that you might be. The other thing that I really like to encourage is to cut out a vice for 6 weeks. So things like alcohol, cigarettes, games, gambling, like things like that can really be expensive. And so when you take something that is draining the bank account out of rotation, you start to build confidence away from that vice, seeing that you're building money. Maybe you start to notice you don't need it, you don't depend on it the way that you once did. And so that can be a really great way to make change, and money can be a motivator to make the changes you need to make. The last strategy that I will encourage is building an emergency fund. A lot of times when I say that to my folks, they're like, Ashley, I'm in significant debt. I'm barely treading water. Like, how are you asking me to make an emergency fund? These are really, really important. It's important to have savings goals. It's important to have reward goals and something to look forward to. And it's important to save for an emergency fund, like, getting new tires or a car breaking down or, things like that. And an emergency fund can, depending on your financial situation, essentially be about 5 to 10% of your income, right? A lot of times I tell folks, start by saving $25 a month, right? Start to put it towards this emergency fund. And what you may notice is what's left over, what you haven't spent from the allowance, can go in the savings or the emergency fund. It helps you to build more confidence in your financial wealth, knowing that you're making different decisions than you have been. So that's a little bit about overspending. Curious as to what your thoughts are, and thank you for listening. Bye.